Madam President, I want to echo the comments made by my colleague from Wyoming regarding regulations. That is something that I hear from small businesses all across South Dakota. Traveling my state during the month of August, I toured businesses, I visited with farmers and ranchers and small business people. That was a recurring theme. One thing that people continued to bring up unsolicited, and when you ask them questions about what can be done to help create jobs, to get them investing and putting their capital to work, that was the overwhelming response. It came back literally every single time that businesses are concerned about the overreaching regulations coming out of Washington, D.C. and the economic uncertainty that it creates. And part of it just has to do with the predictability that businesses need to make long-term investment decisions. If they don't know what's going to happen next in Washington, D.C., it makes it awfully hard for them to plan. And so as a consequence of that, we see billions of dollars, trillions of dollars sitting on the sidelines right now that could be invested, could be put to work, could be getting people back to work in this country. And so last week we all listened with great interest as the President came out to a joint session of Congress and made a speech about a jobs plan. And he talked about pass this jobs plan. And he's been traveling around the country making that same argument. And what was interesting to me about that proposal, and of course the speech itself was sufficiently vague, it was very difficult to know exactly what was in that proposal, where more of those details now are coming to light. But it sounded eerily similar to the very same proposal that we voted on a couple of years ago here in the United States Senate. It ultimately became law. It was called the stimulus bill. It had a price tag of nearly $1 trillion, and the assertions that were made at the time were along the lines that if you pass this, it will keep unemployment below 8%. We all know now that employment is over 9%. And since that stimulus bill was passed, we have lost 1.7 million jobs in our economy. There are 1.7 million fewer Americans employed today than there were when the stimulus bill passed a couple of years ago. And so the question then is, why would we want to go down that same path? And in many respects, this proposal is like that one because it consists of more spending and more taxing and more borrowing, all the things that we believe are detrimental to the economy in the long run. And they do nothing to address the concern that was raised to me by the small businesses across South Dakota and the issue to which the senator from Wyoming was just speaking. That is the issue of overregulation that we keep hearing from our businesses across this country, the job creators in our economy. And so it strikes me that if the President is serious about actually doing something that will create jobs in this country, it ought to involve putting policies in place that will be conducive toward long-term economic growth, to provide the economic certainty that these small businesses across this country are asking for. Right now, there's uncertainty with regard to taxes. Tax rates are at least locked in now until the end of 2012, but beyond that, it's anybody's guess. There's a concern, of course, that any proposal coming out of Washington right now that deals with deficit reduction might include higher taxes. That's certainly something the President put on the table yet again yesterday as a proposed way to pay for his new stimulus bill. And there is this repeated and just consistent assault upon small businesses in the form of more regulations. You know, the President backed off of the ozone regulations, which is something that everybody reacted very favorably toward in the business community and the people that I talked to. But there are so many other regulations that are out there: the CO2 emissions regulation, proposed dust regulations, changing the classification for coal ash. There are all kinds of regulations coming particularly out of the EPA, but not exclusively the EPA, coming out of agencies of this government that are creating greater uncertainty and making it more difficult and more costly for small businesses in this country to create jobs. So why not focus on that issue? Why not focus on getting the free trade agreements, three free trade agreements that were essentially negotiated during the previous administration have been languishing now because they haven't been submitted to Congress for ratification. The President talks about promoting free trade and creating jobs through exports, but you've got 3 free trade agreements that were negotiated back in 2006 and 2007. Colombia, I believe, was December of 2006. Panama and South Korea were June of 2007. And the president gets up and talks about, I want Congress to approve these free trade agreements. We can't do that until he submits them to the Congress. We would love to approve those free trade agreements. It would mean thousands of jobs in this economy. We know that. It is low-hanging fruit. It is something that he could do today that would actually do something positive to actually create jobs in this country. And just as an example, in my state of South Dakota, in 2008, the top 3 crops in my state, corn, wheat, and soybeans, in those 3 commodities, we had 81% of the market in the country of Colombia. 81% of corn, wheat, soybeans market. In 2010, that had dropped off to 19%. It is a major collapse in our market share in that country simply because we have not ratified this free trade agreement, and in the interim, we've had other countries that have moved in and filled the vacuum. And most recently here, the Canadians, in August, I think, 15th, came up with, they had their own bilateral trade agreement with Colombia. We may go down to 0 market share if we don't act quickly to get these trade agreements improved. So, but it's not a function of us wanting to do it. It's a function of the President submitting those agreements to Congress for ratification. We cannot vote on and ratify those trade agreements, put them into effect, and get them implemented absent the President of the United States sending them up here to Capitol Hill. So that's something that Republicans would love to work with the President on. We would also love to work with the President on a moratorium on regulations. I think it would make perfect sense, given what we know about what small businesses are telling us in terms of creating jobs and hiring people and investing capital, that regulation is a huge impediment to that. And so why not, at least for the foreseeable future, until such time as we start getting this unemployment rate down and get people back to work, put a moratorium on all these crazy regulations coming out of Washington, D.C. There are literally millions of jobs that are impacted by these various regulations, according to estimates that have been put forward by organizations like the Chamber of Commerce and others. There are millions of jobs, Madam President, in this country impacted by the issue of regulation. I would think it would make perfect sense for this President to say to us, as part of his jobs package, his jobs plan, we want to work with you to put a moratorium on regulations for a 2-year period till the end of his term in office, whatever that period is, but at least some amount of time so that businesses in this country know with some certainty that if they invest their dollars, they're not going to be slapped with some new regulation coming out of Washington, D.C. There was a story just this morning about 500 jobs lost in the state of Texas over a new EPA regulation. We've seen examples of that in my state of South Dakota. We've had coal-fired power plants that have been nixed simply because of this uncertainty that has been created by regulations coming from Washington, D.C. And so that's something that Republicans here on Capitol Hill, if the President wants to be proactive in terms of job creation and actually having a forward-looking proposal and plan for job creation in this country, he would certainly get cooperation from lots of folks up here on our side of the aisle when it comes to the issue of regulations. Another thing that we would be more than happy to work with the President on is broad-based and comprehensive tax reform. You know, we all talk about it, and nobody seems to be willing, at least from the President's perspective, to put forward a proposal that would actually broaden the tax base in this country, lower the rates on businesses and individuals, and I think lead to an enormous amount of economic growth. Most people that you talk to, again, most businesses suggest that right now in America, the complexity in the tax code, the rates in our tax code make us anti-competitive. We lose jobs every single day to other countries around the world who have lower tax rates. And so businesses are taking their capital and investing it overseas, creating jobs overseas, as opposed to putting it to work here in our country simply because our rates are not competitive. And a good example of that, of course, is our corporate tax rate, which at 35% is the second highest in the world, second only to Japan, and they were going to lower theirs prior to the tsunami. But the fact of the matter, Madam President, is we have tax rates in America today that are making it very difficult for our businesses to compete and to keep those jobs and keep that investment here in this country. So what can you do about that? Well, if you lowered taxes, broad-based, across-the-board tax reductions on individuals and small businesses in this country, lowered taxes on investment, I think you would see an explosion of economic growth and get these businesses, provided that there is enough certainty associated with that. In other words, we don't do it for a short period of time, we do it for a long period of time. You will see businesses pick up on that signal from Washington, D.C., and begin to invest again and get a rate structure that is competitive with other countries around the world. So tax reform, regulations, regulatory reform, a moratorium on regulations, trade, those are all issues that we are more than willing to work with this president on if he is willing to work with us, because those are policies proven over time that actually will create jobs for this country. And again, they're the things that we consistently hear. I dare to say that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are hearing the same thing I'm hearing. I certainly hear it from colleagues on my side who in their travels in their individual states are repeatedly visited by small businesses, and when they go to make contact with their small businesses, hear this over and over and over again. These are the issues that the American business community is saying we need to address if we want to get people back to work in this country. And so I'm certainly hopeful that the President will change directions away from what he is proposing to do now, which is a very similar path to what was done 2 years ago, which we all know has been unsuccessful. If you look at it based upon the metrics, and again, I'm talking about job creation, if you look at it based upon the employment rate in this country, the unemployment rate has gone up, the number of jobs lost has gone up, the amount of our debt has gone up by $4 trillion, so we have borrowed more, we are spending more, and we are getting nothing in return. In fact, the very opposite of what we hope to get, and that is job creation. That approach has not worked. Let's don't double down on that and go back and try the same failed policies again. Let's change direction. Let's go a different direction for this country, and I would hope the President would do that. Now, the other thing I think that's particularly troubling about his proposal, not to mention some of the things that he put out in his speech last week that give me a good amount of heartburn in terms of the direction he's headed, is how he proposes to pay for that, because it was indicated yesterday that 90% of the cost of this stimulus bill would be paid for by allowing or preventing people to take deductions, the two top income tax rates in this country, and the people who are in those income tax brackets, to be able to claim deductions on their tax returns. Well, that impacts millions of Americans and millions of job creators, millions of small businesses, not to mention a lot of charities. Many of the people who contribute to charities today don't do it simply because of the tax consequence, but I do believe they do. The amount that they contribute to a charity is affected by the tax code, and certainly reducing the amount that they can deduct is going to make it more difficult for many of our charitable organizations around this country who rely upon the generosity of people, and in many cases high-income people in this country. That being said, raising taxes, in my view, is not the way to pay for a new stimulus, a stimulus 2.0, an approach that has been tried and failed, and something that we should be not moving toward but moving away from and moving in a different direction. And so, Madam President, again, we have no greater priority in America today than getting this economy growing, creating jobs, getting people back to work. That helps bring in more revenue into the federal government. It helps deal with our issue of the deficit and the debt. There are really two issues we can deal with that. We can reduce spending and we can grow the economy. We've got to do both. And certainly those are not unrelated. When we reduce spending, I think that's essential to growing the economy, but we also have to put policies in place that will grow the economy and create jobs. Raising taxes is not the way to do that. And so the President's proposal to pay for his new stimulus bill, which raises taxes on people in this country, is a wrong-headed approach. It has not worked in the past. It will not work in the future. We need to try a different direction. But Republicans are willing, ready, and able to work with this President on passing trade agreements that have been languishing around here literally for 4 to 5 years, on reducing the overreaching regulations which are creating economic uncertainty for our small businesses across this country, and on tax reform that would lower rates and broaden the tax base in this country, and I think bring in an incredible explosion of economic growth and jobs. Those are the types of things that we ought to be looking at, long-term policies that will affect in a positive way the environment, the atmosphere in this country for our job creators, not doing another Washington-directed spending program that has already demonstrated that it doesn't work. Mr. President, I yield the floor.